hold on. Before we start this video, I have a gift for you because I prepared an ebook about the 10 most important vehicles of World War II. To download it, all you need to do is click the link below or scan this QR code here, which will take you to our page where you'll fill out a quick little form that won't take you even 3 minutes. And then you'll be able to download your gift. That way you can compare my list of the most important vehicles with your own list. And the best part is that you'll be helping the War Room channel better understand who our audience is, who you are. That way we can always offer the best content the way you like it. So don't forget to download your ebook. And now let's get to our story. I always start these Expeditionary Force videos by saying that the Expeditionary Force does, in fact, have a lot of books. Many people who took part in the Expeditionary Force wrote books, and several authors who came after that time also wrote very important works about the Expeditionary Force. But for the first time, I did a specialized reading about a branch of the Expeditionary Force that we rarely read about. I just finished reading this book here. Man, look, Quebra Canela. Quebra Canela. You can see the subtitle, which is actually up there, right? It's about Brazilian engineering in the Italian campaign. In other words, we're talking about the 9th Engineering Battalion, which is a unit that was part of the Expeditionary Force. A battalion that is about a third of the strength of an infantry regiment. But maybe, right? Was it? I believe so. It was the most specialized troop in the Brazilian Expeditionary Force. Why? Because engineering really in World War II, American engineering was the troop that had the most technology embedded in its daily processes. That is, metal detectors, various types of equipment for mine removal, right? For building bridges, building roads, and clearing roads. So it was a troop extremely specialized in a type of combat variation that the infantrymen had no idea how to carry out. This book here is authored by General Raul de Cruz Lima Jr. Raul de Cruz Lima Jr. was a captain at the time, and he commanded the 2nd Company of the 9th Engineering Battalion. This book here is in its 3rd edition by Bibliex, and it contains prefaces from the 1st and 2nd editions. The preface of the 1st edition is by Colonel Jose Machado Lopez, who was the commander of the 9th Engineering Battalion and Colonel Lopez. He is very complimentary of this work here for the way Raul managed to speak clearly, simply, and fluently about everything that happened in the process of creating the battalion, integrating this battalion into the Brazilian Expeditionary Force, and also using this battalion on the front line. All the glories and also the setbacks, but in a very clear way, Remar. For you, this is an extremely light read, a very captivating read that will make you finish this book here, which has just over 200 pages, in a few days. Man, I read this in just over a week. It's really a very pleasant read because it doesn't focus solely on the technical aspects of engineering. As you can imagine, and as I've already mentioned here, there are many technical aspects of engineering, but also on the much lighter aspect of organization, from the memory of a battle veteran, recounting the events from 35 years earlier in his life. Break a leg. I mean, a specialist type specialized in German anti-personnel mines, which were intended to injure the enemy combatant and not to kill the enemy combatant. This mine was known by the Germans as the Schumine. Why? Because it had enough explosives to cause damage up to the middle of the enemy soldier's shin. In other words, it would blow off the soldier's leg up to the middle of the shin. That's why it's known as the shin breaker. Many Brazilian soldiers were injured by the Schumine, and it was a very special problem for the engineering battalion. Since the Schumine was made of costly wood, it wasn't made of metal. In fact, the Americans who were deployed ended up being used very little in Italy because the mines that the Germans started using in the last years of the war were wooden mines and concrete mines, and the Schumine in particular was made of wood. In other words, the soldier had to go forward. He had to poke the ground of the mined area with a bayonet or some kind of blade. He had to use a pointed blade until he managed to find the mine, then carefully dig it up and remove its triggering devices. The whole story begins with the founding of the 9th Engineering Battalion, because the 9th Engineering Battalion was founded in Aquidauana, in what was then southern Mato Grosso, now Mato Grosso do Sul. Since the state didn't exist then, Dutra ordered the creation of this battalion in 1942. A new battalion. So all the officers were taken from Rio de Janeiro and sent by train to Mato Grosso to establish this unit in Mato Grosso. And Captain Raul at the time was part of the original personnel of this unit, So he goes on to tell in first person the whole process of creation, the difficulties, the shortages that the unit went through in what was then a distant place, a distant province like Mato Grosso was in the 1940s. Next, the unit was integrated into the Brazilian Expeditionary Force because Dutra chose the 9th Engineering Battalion because it was a new unit, but also because it wasn't in the military regions from which the soldiers of the Infantry of Faith would be recruited. The Engineering Battalion is transported to Rio de Janeiro. And at that moment, we already have some insights from Captain Raul regarding the battalion's personnel. A good part of that original personnel was made up of problematic soldiers, because serving in Mato Grosso at the time was considered a kind of punishment for undisciplined members of the Army. There was, as part of the health selection for the Engineering Battalion, a replacement of a huge part of the battalion's personnel. So, many soldiers were dismissed and left at their place of origin, and several other soldiers were recruited to make up the personnel of the Engineering Battalion. And it's interesting how once this battalion was inserted into the Expeditionary Force, starting in August 1943, it received the first combat engineering manuals. The modern ones, from the American Army, made it clear how far the battalion's reality was from the tasks it was supposed to carry out on the front line. So, can you imagine that in such an isolated place like that in 1943, there weren't even mines to practice demining? So, the battalion commander's solution was to request all the cans of guava paste from the mess hall and also from the city of Aquidauana itself. Whatever they could get, all the cans of guava paste, to turn those cans into mock mines. So, the soldiers started training for minefield clearing with guava paste cans, shortly after this training began. However, the troops received an order to relocate to Rio de Janeiro, but not to the capital Rio de Janeiro, but to the city of Três Rios, which is in the interior of the state. This is also a curious fact and was criticized by Captain Raul, because right from the start, the two troops were separated. The infantry troop was separated and stationed at the military village in the capital Rio de Janeiro, while the engineering troop was stationed hundreds of kilometers away in Três Rios. So there was no prior knowledge, no exchange of experiences, or even familiarity among the people between the two troops, which led to later problems. There, on the battlefield, in Italy, when the first echelon of the Brazilian Expeditionary Force embarked for Italy in July 1944, the engineering component, which goes along with the first echelon, is Captain Muller's first company. After embarkation, the engineering battalion is transferred to the military village in Rio de Janeiro and occupies the barracks, which belonged to the 6th Infantry Regiment, which had gone to Italy. And at that moment, we have here in the book the description of some specialized training that I myself had no idea the Brazilian Expeditionary Force had carried out in Rio de Janeiro, such as, for example, amphibious landing on beaches, right there on the beaches of the South Zone. In Rio de Janeiro, several simulated landings of engineering troops were carried out on the beach. So the troops went through this kind of specialized training in Rio de Janeiro. But really, they would only come into contact with most of the modern equipment in Italy when they were finally transferred there in September. So we have a very interesting section here in the book that talks about the transfer of the troops from Naples to Livorno, which took place aboard the LCIs, the landing craft infantry, those infantry landing ships that could hold on average about 200 soldiers. But then he describes a scene that I pictured in my head, him sailing up the Mediterranean Sea towards Livorno at night. At the beginning of the night, he stuck his head out of the boat to get some fresh air. And Captain Raoul was watching the horizon when he looked down and saw one of his soldiers staring intently at him from below. And then he had a moment of reflection. At that moment, he said the following: all our behavior, all our actions as Army officers are constantly being observed by our soldiers, so our behavior will be judged by them today and forever. It may seem kind of obvious, I know, but reading the words of an officer actually reporting this in his memoirs is quite rare. But once they actually arrive at the theater of operations, they will go directly to Porretta Terme in the Reno Valley. Captain Raoul will report where the 2nd Company was stationed in the city, and it was stationed right at the entrance of the city. We, who were on the mission in April 2025, the snake smoked. We were able to get to know the whole city of Porretta Terme, so we saw that at the entrance of the city, it really is quite far from where the headquarters was, at the back of the city. The city, really, it's very long, narrow and long because it follows the riverbed. So, Captain Raoul, he reports the constant heavy artillery bombardments from the Germans, which went over his command post, heading toward the Brazilian Expeditionary Force headquarters at the end of the city. So he describes how they would hear the whistling of those artillery shells constantly. And also, man, in this book here in Quebra-Canela, it has the best description, or maybe the most terrifying description, of an artillery bombardment that I've ever seen. Reported by a Brazilian soldier, Captain Raoul. He narrates here the first bombardment, which was directed at the Brazilian Expeditionary Force Engineering, the Brazilian Expeditionary Force Engineering Command Post, at the entrance of Porretta Terme, and how this bombardment claimed the lives of 2 soldiers from his company. In other words, 2 fatalities who were killed before even entering combat. It's a really touching, very sad part of this book here, and it's really worth reading to check it out. But, as I already told you, the engineering and infantry had been trained separately in 2 different cities. This ended up having an impact when they went into combat in Italy, because they didn't know exactly what the limits of the engineering corps were and where the infantry should actually step in. In this equation, the big problem, according to Captain Raoul, is the infantry wanting to depend 100% on the engineering corps to prepare their actions. In other words, if there's a minefield up ahead, it's 100% the engineering corps' responsibility to clear that minefield so that the infantry can operate. Or should the infantry itself also have its own sappers to remove those devices? This book offers a great reflection on the topic, which I really liked. But then comes the winter of 44 to 45, when the front line becomes completely paralyzed, so the engineers won't have much to do. At that time, many soldiers were sent to specialization courses at the American School of Engineering, which was located in southern Italy. And then, Captain Raoul also talks about a break, a leave he had in Rome, spending a few days with other officers from his company. And then he describes the whole atmosphere in Rome during Christmas of 1944. He even talks about the dances that were organized by the American Army and that they stayed. Those huge lines of the so-called signorini, ladies or young girls, who were all waiting there to be chosen as a soldier's dance partner so they could get something to eat, given the lack of food throughout the whole region of Italy at that time. After winter ends, offensives and the push for Monte Castello resume. This is the first phase of the preparation to reach the starting positions for the final offensive planned to crush the Germans in northern Italy. And that's when you'll get the description of the most intense period of engineering operations by the Brazilian Expeditionary Force in the Italian campaign, because it's right after the conquest of Monte Castello Hill that the engineers have to clear all the minefields. Clear all the minefields that were placed around the hill on the east, west, and north sides of the hill to open the way for the infantry to advance beyond the hill. Next, there's a vivid account of an episode significant for Captain Raul's company. That's when Sergeant Luis Ribeiro Pires enters a house that had been mined by the Germans, precisely to disarm all those explosives inside, but the house simply explodes with him inside. So it's a death that everyone in the company feels, and it makes you, as a reader, also feel the loss of that sergeant who was very much loved by everyone in the company. But right after that, in the attack on Sopracciato, that is, right before the attack on Castello no Ovo, Captain Raul, once again, really surprises here with his ability to tell, to report to you what happened when he describes an attack by the Brazilian Expeditionary Force. In sync with an assault team made up of infantry and engineering elements, moving forward together, working as a team. For the first time, this was at the very beginning of March 1945, to be able to take one of the slopes of Morro do Sopracciato. And then you have that wonderful description of the soldiers using bazookas to silence German machine guns, and the engineering soldiers clearing the way through the fields, removing mines and laying down white ropes to guide the infantry soldiers through that extremely dangerous path. And then they managed to take the position without any fatal casualties. And then there's the spring offensive, this time seen through the eyes of the engineering corps, which is now fully in tune with modern warfare. In fact, Captain Raul reports how he took a course at the end of March 1945 with the United States Engineering Corps, and the Americans demonstrated the use of armored bulldozers, which allowed the operator to clear roads under enemy fire. At that time, the Brazilian Expeditionary Force engineering companies only had Caterpillar D7 bulldozers, which were not armored. If you enjoyed this video, then share it with your friends, and also give us a thumbs up. And don't forget to subscribe to War Room so you don't miss anything else. I'll be signing off now. Thank you again for watching, and here's a big hug from the War Room.